to our Nancy Drew book. Today has been a nice, relaxing day. It's been raining here in Arizona, the Phoenix area, and so we've just been warm and cozy as one does when it's raining. But let us go ahead and switch over to reading the next few chapters of Nancy Drew, The Invisible Intruder. A quick recap. We have read the first 4 chapters, and we learned that Nancy Drew, along with George, Bess, and a few other couples, and including Ned, Dave, and I don't know why I can't remember his name. It starts with a B. We'll get there. Sorry. Foggy mind. But they all decided that they're going to go on a ghost hunting sort of expedition. There's 5 mysteries that they're going to look to solve on this hunting tour. And so right now they are at the first, about a haunted canoe. When they get there, they quickly get to see their first moment with the canoe, and they've met a balloon ghost. And most recently, Ned and Nancy went out on the lake again. They were following the haunted canoe in their own canoe, and basically a capsize happens and they get pulled underwater, and Ned was getting dragged away by an octopus. So let us continue with Chapter 5, The Suspicious Flight. In a panic over Ned's safety, Nancy raced through the water after him and his captor. Was the creature that was dragging him along a real octopus, or a man wearing a disguise? The chase seemed endless. "Let him go!" Nancy cried out as she thrashed through the water. But just when she was on the verge of overtaking the tentacled creature, it suddenly released Ned and dived under the water. A new fear took possession of Nancy. Was the octopus going to attack her? Pushing the thought out of her mind, Nancy gave a final spurt and reached Ned. Fortunately, the shore was not far away. Could she tow Ned there in safety? Apparently, the attacker did not intend to make further trouble. It did not reappear, and Nancy managed to get Ned onto dry land and began giving him first aid. She knew he had not taken any water into his lungs because he kept blinking and murmuring, "Get the octopus." Presently, he was able to tell Nancy what had happened. "When we were thrown into the water, the octopus grabbed me. It hit my head with one of the tentacles and I went under. I had enough sense to hold my breath until we rose to the surface. Then I managed to flop onto my back, but after that, I guess I blacked out for a while." Nancy said the strange creature had disappeared underwater. "Have you any idea who or what it was?" she asked. Ned shook his head. "I'm sure octopuses don't live in this lake, so this one must have been imported. I think," Nancy said, "that it was a man in disguise. It's further evidence that someone is doing all these weird things to frighten us away from Pine Grove Camp. I have a hunch it's young Mr. Prizer." "You're probably right," Ned agreed. "Well, shall we start back to camp?" Neither their overturned canoe nor the self-paddling craft was in sight. Dive down and see if ours sank, Nancy offered. When she surfaced, Ned asked, "Any luck?" "Not yet." Nancy dived deeply and swam underwater for nearly a minute. "I certainly don't see our canoe," she told herself ruefully. After a rest, she tried once more. Her search was fruitless. She and Ned concluded that it had been stolen by the octopus man. "Do you feel up to a trek?" she asked him. "Oh, I guess we'll have to walk way around the lake to get back to camp." "I'm afraid so." The other ghost hunters were still on the beach when Nancy and Ned returned. They were amazed when Nancy related what had happened. Rita did not express her thoughts aloud, but the smile on her face plainly indicated an "I told you so." Bert and Dave decided to take a powerboat and hunt for the missing camp canoe, the craft that propelled itself, and the octopus. "I'm sure there's a connection between the last two," Nancy told them just before they roared off. Les insisted that Nancy and Ned take a rest. They agreed, but first stopped at the lodge to tell Mr. Leffert about the missing canoe and the other mysterious incidents. He was standing behind the desk talking to the clerk. When Ronnie, the clerk, heard the story, his eyes opened wide. "I've been told there's a monster in the lake," he said. "I didn't believe it, but now I do." Mr. Leffert pounded the desk and said, "That settles it. I'm selling the place. The whole thing has gone far enough. Just this morning I received an offer for the camp. I'll take it and get out of here before I lose any more money." As he bellowed, an idea came to Nancy. She asked, "By any chance is the prospective buyer's name Prizer?" Mr. Leffert looked at her in surprise. "Why, yes, it is. How did you know that?" She and Ned explained about going to see Mrs. Tarpey, the realtor, and learning that a man named Wilbur Prizer had been inquiring about the camp. "Please wait a little longer," Nancy urged Mr. Leffert. "I have a hunch we're going to solve the mystery. By the way, I suppose the price you were offered for the camp is very low compared to what it's worth." "Yes, it is," Mr. Leffert said. "Then please wait," Nancy pleaded. Mr. Leffert agreed to do this. He just made the promise when the telephone rang and he scooped it up. In a moment he said, "Yes, Mr. Prizer." Nancy and Ned looked at each other, wondering whether Prizer would be persuasive enough to talk Mr. Leffert into selling after all. But the proprietor put him off. "I'd like a few days to make up my mind," he said. The caller became very angry and insistent and talked so loudly that Nancy and Ned could hear every word. Prizer did everything but threaten Mr. Leffert to agreeing to sell the camp. At one point, Nancy was afraid the proprietor might give in and kept shaking her head to encourage him to delay. "This is my final answer for the moment," Mr. Leffert told his caller. "I will let you know my decision in a few days." As Prizer yelled louder, Mr. Leffert said, "I am very busy. I must say goodbye." He hung up. The other ghost hunters entered the lodge just then and were apprised of the latest development. All were pleased that Nancy had persuaded Mr. Leffert to wait before selling his property. The group was about to scatter and dress for lunch when they heard the dock bell ringing furiously. "Something's happened!" cried Mr. Leffert. Nancy was already out the door and running toward the dock. Bess and George were close at her heels. Bert and Dave were standing up in the camp's motorboat. As their friends arrived, Bert held up an octopus. its 8 tentacles waving messily. "Look out," he cried. With that, he threw the octopus directly toward the oncoming ghost hunters. Bess screamed and turned around. George and the others dodged the creature as it landed on the dock. Though its great arms continued to wave around, the octopus did not move away. Bert and Dave burst into uproarious laughter. Nancy grinned. "You old fakers," she exclaimed. "Where did you get this rubber octopus? And what makes it wiggle?" "We found it near where Ned was attacked," Dave replied. Ned looked puzzled. "If this is what attacked me, a man must have been inside the thing or back of it." "If he's using the creature to scare people," said Nancy, "why did he let the octopus loose?" George spoke up. "Maybe he didn't plan to let it go, but had to when Nancy drew close to him." Bert said that he and Dave had found the fake octopus lying on the beach. While examining it, they had discovered how to start the mechanism which made it wriggle through the water. In a few moments, the tiny motor ran down and the rubber octopus lay still. Nancy had gone to the edge of the dock and noticed that the canoe was tied to the motor belt. "Is this the camp canoe?" she asked. Dave nodded. "It was way up at the far end of the lake, but we didn't find the one that propels itself." Ned pulled the aluminum craft up on the beach and began to inspect it. He said, "Something was keeping Nancy and me from making any progress in the water. Maybe there's a hidden gadget." Bess looked fearful again. "You mean someone deliberately put a gadget in it so he could control the canoe?" "I suspect so," Ned replied. He searched the craft thoroughly, but found nothing. It was removed, Ned decided. As he straightened up, George said, "If someone was trying to cause an accident, he wouldn't know which canoe would be chosen to take out on the lake." "You're right," Ned agreed. "Let's look in the others. Come on, fellows." Under the rear seat of each craft, the boys found a radio-controlled mechanism. The movements of the canoes could be controlled from some hidden spot along the shore. "I see it all now," Nancy remarked. "The canoe that propels itself is probably also radio-controlled. At a certain point where the operator was hidden along the shore, the canoe was used as bait. Ned, you and I swallowed the bait." He nodded. "Then the person held our canoe back and finally upset it. He or someone else jumped into the water with the octopus and attacked me." Jim Archer spoke up. "I'd say that the octopus man or people working with him are trained engineers." "But nuts," George commented in disgust. The gadgets were removed from the canoes and turned over to Mr. Leffert. He notified the police, who later came to take the gadgets. The two officers were amazed and greatly concerned about the rash way in which the devices were being used. The next morning, Nancy said to the ghost hunters, "I think we should call on elderly Mr. Prizer again and tell him about the canoes and the octopus. We might learn from his reaction if his son was really behind the attack." Babs said she would like to go and see the man's shell collection. Dawn offered to drive her. Ned, Bert, and Dave agreed to go, but the other ghost hunters decided not to join them. "You tell us about it," Anne said, smiling. When Nancy and her friends arrived at the Prizer cottage, there was no answer to their knock. They looked in the windows and could see every part of the interior. No one was there. And Nancy noticed that the cradle shell was gone. "Well, we can't break in," Bab remarked. "I guess we'll have to go back to camp without learning anything." Just then they saw a woman coming down the path toward the cottage. She was striding vigorously and swinging her arms. There was a set expression on her face. "She sure looks mad," Dawn remarked. "That's Mrs. Tarpey, the realtor," Nancy told him. As the woman stormed up to them, she did not recognize any of the callers at once. "If you're looking for that old geezer who was staying here," she said, "he skipped." gift, Nancy repeated. You mean he has left? I mean more than that, Mrs. Tarpey said angrily. Not only did he move out bag and baggage, but his relatives gave me a check that bounced. George remarked, then probably it's just as well that he's gone. You can rent the place to someone else. Maybe and maybe not, Mrs. Tarpey said. With all the goings on around here, it's doubtful. Suddenly she recognized Nancy. You're the girl who was asking me about the prizers. When Nancy nodded, the realtor said, Did you find out anything about them? Nancy repeated what little she had learned, particularly that the younger prizers had no children. Bess said, I feel sorry for the old man. He's not to blame for what his son and wife do. Nancy was not so sure that the old man deserved any sympathy. She was inclined to think he was part of the racket. Bab remarked, The senior Mr. Prizer said he had a fabulous shell collection. I wanted so much to see it. Mrs. Tarpey tossed her head. If he had one, it was probably stolen from somebody. Stolen? Bab exclaimed. Yes. Didn't you hear the news report this morning? What was the news report? Nancy asked. Oh, sorry. Now we are going to start Chapter 6. A Curious Prophecy. What was the news report? Nancy asked. Mrs. Tarpey said that a valuable collection of shells had been stolen in the nearby town of Sheldon. The collector had been away for a couple of weeks. Upon his return, he had discovered the loss. The shells were worth a great deal of money, Mrs. Tarpey exclaimed. Some of them are very rare. One of the Murex shells, a branderus, belonged to an ancient emperor. At the time he lived, people found that the branderus secreted a yellow fluid. When processed, it gave out a permanent purple dye, which was used to color cloth for togas. Only emperors and kings were allowed to wear them. How fascinating, Bess remarked. I can understand why the stolen collection was a real haul for the thief. Nancy said she would like to go into the cabin and see if she could find any clues to help solve the mystery of the lake. Also, any clues to where the prizers may have gone. May we go in, Mrs. Tarpey? Yes, and I hope you find something so I can trace those crooks. The group entered and immediately began their search. George looked through a pile of newspapers in a corner. Those of local origin did not contain any stories which might give a clue, but on the bottom of the pile she noticed a Florida paper. Suspicious, she called Nancy over and showed it to her. There might be something here Mr. Prizer wanted to keep, she said. Help me look at all the articles. The girl scanned one column after another without finding anything that might relate to the Prizers. Then, on the next to the last page, Nancy spotted a marked article. Stolen shell collection remains a mystery. The item stated that an intruder had stolen a collection of priceless shells, some of them in the room where the owner was asleep. Nancy, do you suppose that intruder could possibly have been young Mr. Prizer after more shells? Nancy nodded. Or old Mr. Prizer. By this time, the other searchers were ready to give up. They had found no worthwhile clues. Look at this, said Bess, and showed them the news item. Nancy went over to Mrs. Tarpey. Is there an attic or a cellar in this cottage? She asked. There's no cellar, but there is an attic. You have to remove one of the panels in the ceiling to get to it. I think we should look up there, Nancy told her, and she agreed. We'd better have one of the boys go up. Nancy asked Ned if he would do it. As everyone looked on, he hoisted himself to Bert's shoulders and slid the panel back. Then he climbed into the attic. Those below waited expectantly. The attic floor squeaked and groaned as Ned moved around. That floor doesn't sound very safe, Bess whispered to Nancy. No, it doesn't, Nancy agreed. The stillness was suddenly shattered by a shout from Ned. The mystery is solved, he called down. What did you find? Nancy asked. The canoe, the self-propelling canoe. How marvelous. Ned called out, Bert, Dave, Don, you grab the canoe as I slide it through the opening. The girls moved out of the way, and the boys took their positions under the attic opening. Here goes, Ned cried out. As he started to shove the canoe over the edge, there was a splintering sound, and the whole floor at one end of the opening gave way. Ned and the canoe dropped into space. While Bert and Dave braced themselves to catch Ned, George and Nancy leapt forward to help Don keep the canoe from smashing to the floor. Ned was caught neatly, and the craft lowered with only a slight bump. Mrs. Tarpey, almost beside herself with excitement, said, Well, of all things, those wicked people, and now I'll have a big repair bill on that ceiling. The young people began to examine the canoe. Ned pointed out a complicated set of gadgets under both the front and rear seats. One motor worked the front paddle, another the stern. Both were attached by permanent swiveling fixtures. Still, another motor was used to receive remote control signals. Actually, it's very ingenious, said Don. Just then they heard voices outside, and two police officers walked in. Mrs. Tarpey had reported the check swindle, and the men had come to investigate the cottage. Mrs. Tarpey introduced them to the group, then said, I guess these young folks have solved the mystery of the ghostly happenings on Lake 70. She told the officers of Nancy's hunch there might be a clue in the attic, and that the canoe had been found there. The men looked at Nancy and smiled. You have great sagacity, young lady, one of them said. You've saved us a lot of trouble. Bess showed the officers the Florida newspaper, and they decided to take it along, as well as the canoe, for possible evidence against the prisers. Since there was nothing more the ghost hunters could do at the cottage, Nancy suggested they leave. Mrs. Tarpey and the officers thanked them for their help as they said goodbye. Climbing the hill to their cars, Babs said, I'm glad this case is closed. Now we can go on to the next one. That really should be exciting. You mean the medium at whose hut thunder always rolls during her seances? Don asked. Yes. Nancy reminded them that even though the ghost hunters had found the mysterious canoe and had unearthed information concerning the nefarious acts of the prisers, they still had not caught them. Babs sighed. As long as we debunk the ghost business, do we have to capture the villains? George answered, We usually do. Nancy never leaves a case unfinished. Ned laughed. That's right, and I'll bet she'll catch up with the prisers. When they reached the lodge, Nancy told Mr. Leffert what they had learned. He was delighted and relieved that the prisers had left town. Now I can fill my camp with guests, and nobody will be afraid to go in or on the lake. I just can't thank you young people enough. Nancy said she and her friends were sorry to leave such an attractive place. But we have another job to do, so we'll be checking out soon. The other ghost hunters were consulted, and it was decided to leave early the following morning. Their destination was Vernonville. When they reached there, Helen and Jim made arrangements at an attractive one-story motel. As soon as the group had checked in, Helen asked the desk clerk, Miss Adelaide, about the medium and when she held seances. She consulted a calendar of local events. Madame Tarantella is having a seance this evening just for women. Before it starts, she would hold consultations with troubled souls. This struck George funny. Striking a pose with her feet far apart and her hands on her hips, she said in a nasal tone, Nancy, Bess, all of us are in real trouble, ain't we? The other girls burst into laughter. Becoming serious, they decided they would go to Madame Tarantella's directly after supper. Each would try to see her privately. The other women ghost hunters decided to attend the seance but not to go early for separate consultations. I'm surprised that you want one, Rita said to Nancy. You're so practical. Nancy smiled. My main reason for going is to study the woman and her hut. As the three girls drove off later in Nancy's car, George remarked, what a beautiful evening it was. If there's any thunder during the seance tonight, it'll have to be artificial. I guess the medium pulls this trick to scare people. A few minutes later, Nancy drove up to a wooden shack with the sign Prophecies on the door. The building seemed out of place in an area of small apartment houses. I guess we're first to arrive, said George. A small man dressed like a gypsy admitted the girls and escorted them to a rear room. The light was dim, but they could distinguish a rather heavy-set woman dressed as a gypsy fortune-teller. She was seated at a table. Bess began to count the bracelets on her arm, but before she could finish, the woman said in a deep, husky voice, I will take this young lady first. She raised herself up a little to touch Nancy's shoulder. Will you two please remain outside? Bess and George left the inner room and sat down in the larger area where the seance would be held. Madame Tarantella asked Nancy to be seated in front of her across the table. She took the girl's right hand in hers, but did not look at it. She merely stared at Nancy's face and began to talk. It was a surprise to Nancy that the medium told her so many things about herself that were true. She did not see how the woman could possibly have found them out, since she did not know Nancy was coming. The medium smiled at her. You're a sweet, understanding young lady. As a result, you have many friends. A tall, dark, good-looking college man is very dear to you. In the future, you will be asked to make a decision involving this friend. You're a happy person by nature, but always longing for a mystery to solve. Usually you are trying to help someone, but my advice to you is to be very careful in the future. So far you have had good luck, but this may run out at any moment. Madame Tarantella stopped speaking. Suddenly she got up from her chair, came around the table, and faced the young sleuth. She moved her head in a swaying motion, her eyes rolling in a strange fashion. Nancy was a bit frightened. She rose, thinking she had better leave. Before she could move, the medium stiffened and clutched Nancy by her shoulders in an iron grip. She looked straight at Nancy, her eyes glowing like coals of fire. In an awesome stage whisper, she said, You can help me right now. In fact, you must do it, and without hesitation. What do you mean? Nancy asked. That you are in my power and must help me. Nancy's one thought was to get away from this woman, but she was unable to do so. Madame Tarantella put both arms around her shoulders and closed them like a vice. All right, we are on to our next chapter, Chapter 7, The Mysterious Box. In the seance room, Bess and George began to worry about Nancy. I think we'd better go inside and see how Nancy is making out, said Bess. George agreed, and the two girls walked into the back room. They were horrified by what they saw. Madame Tarantula, her eyes gleaming, held Nancy in a vice-like grip. "Stop that!" George exclaimed, and Bess added, "Let her go at once." Although Nancy seemed to be calm, the cousins had a distinct feeling that their friend had had a rather bad fright. She smiled at the girls as the medium released her. "Thanks," Nancy murmured. The woman shook her head and shoulders as if coming out of a trance and said, "Forgive me, I just had a frightening premonition." "About me?" Nancy asked. George chuckled. "A little shiver now and then won't hurt you." When their friends arrived, the three girls went to sit with them. In a whisper, Bess told them what had happened to Nancy and how peculiar Madame Tarantella was. Helen grinned. "It sounds as if this might be good fun." Oh, I do apologize. I missed part of a page, or like a page, 2 pages. Okay, so let's go back to the medium. And she comes out of a trance and then says, "Forgive me, I just had a frightening premonition." "About me?" Nancy asked. No, it had to do entirely with me. I could see a man coming to attack me. I felt as if he were going to kill me." "How dreadful," Bess said. George spoke up. "Why would he want to do that?" The medium blinked her eyes rapidly, as if trying to shut out the awful sight. "He wanted me to give him certain papers of a highly secret nature." "You don't have to do it," George remarked. "Oh, you don't know this man," Madame Tarantula said. She turned to Nancy. "You are always ready and willing to help people. Now I implore your help. You must take the papers with you and keep them for me." Nancy was startled by the suggestion. She had no intention of acceding to the request, but her instincts told her that she might have stumbled upon a clue to the mystery of the woman in her strange life. "My father is a lawyer," she said finally. "I will ask him if it will be all right." In her heart she was sure he would not allow it. "I can't wait that long," Madame Tarantella replied. "You must take them tonight." George interrupted. "Why don't you put the papers in the safe deposit box?" The woman did not answer. Instead, she rolled her eyes around again. Bess was beginning to quiver with fear. She was about to urge that they all leave when the medium suddenly looked perfectly normal, smiled sweetly, and said to Bess, "You're very pretty. Do you have a problem?" Bess did not reply. She said to Nancy and George, "Let's get out of here." "Don't be in a hurry, my dear," Madame Tarantella said. "When I have premonitions, I sometimes act strangely, people tell me. I assure you I would not do you any harm." The medium looked at a clock on the wall. "It will soon be time for the seance to begin. I must have a few minutes in which to get myself ready and composed. Please wait in the large room. There will be some interesting messages relayed tonight that I will receive from the spirits." "How much do I owe you?" Nancy asked the medium. The woman smiled. "I have no fee. My clients pay me in proportion to the help they feel they have received. In this case, I am asking for your help, so there will be no charge." The three girls filed out, and at once Beth urged that they leave the hut. "While the going is good," she added, "I want no part of this strange, fake setup." "The other woman will soon be here, and you'll be perfectly safe," Nancy said soothingly. "But this place gives me the shivers," Bess argued. George chuckled. "A little shiver now and then won't hurt you." When their friends arrived, the three girls went to sit with them. In a whisper, Bess told them what had happened to Nancy and how peculiar Madame Tarantella was. Helen grinned. "It sounds as if this might be good fun." Bab whispered, I hope no spirit comes down and vanishes in a swirling cloud with one of us. Other women and girls came in, and the room was soon filled. Presently the lights were dimmed, and a hush came over the place. Madame Tarantella swept through the doorway from the rear room and ascended a little platform. She was wearing a flowing robe made of glittering material and a long-haired black wig. On her head was an iridescent crown, and she carried a wand which had a tiny light on the end. George whispered to Nancy with a soft giggle, "She looks like a cross between Cinderella and a witch." Reaching the center of the platform, Madame Tarantella waved the wand in a semicircle several times. Then slowly she began to speak in a deep monotone. "Gracious spirit of those who have gone before," she said, "bring us messages for the assembled group." Tiny flickering lights began to glow above her head. Within seconds, a high-pitched feminine voice spoke as if coming from a distance. It murmured, "My daughter is sitting among you. I want to tell you, Martha, to be more careful with your money." As the so-called spirit voice stopped speaking, Madame Tarantella raised her wand high, looked out over the audience, and asked, "Is Martha here?" A sob came from somewhere in the audience, and a woman cried out, oh yes, my mother. She was always warning me to take better care of my money." Bess grabbed Nancy's hand. "I don't like this. I'm afraid of it. Let's go, please." Before the girls could make a move, Madame Tarantella began to speak again. Waving her wand toward the audience, she said, "There is a frightened, doubting girl here. Her name is Bess. Oh, spirit world, can you send her a reassuring message?" Bess sat petrified. Did the woman mean her? Nancy and George were amazed and remained motionless, listening intently for what was about to come from the spirit world. Presently, a man's deep voice said in a harsh whisper, "I was once in charge of the marriage license bureau in your town, Bess Marvin. I have a message for you from the spirit world. Soon you will be going to the license bureau to prepare for your own wedding." Bess buried her face in her hands. Then she leaned toward Nancy and began to cry. She whispered, "It can't be true. Dave has to finish college first." Nancy put an arm around the distraught girl. At the same time, George murmured, "Perhaps we..." This time Nancy agreed. Just as the girls were about to get up, there was a deep, reverberating roll of thunder. Bess, even more worried now, said, "Oh, I don't want to go out in a thunderstorm. I don't like thunder and lightning." "Don't you remember?" Nancy whispered. "This may be part of the seance. It doesn't necessarily mean a rainstorm." Holding Nancy's arms, Bess got up and left the hut with her chums. There was no rain, but a storm was brewing. The girls walked quickly toward their car. Not far away was a small park with a steel flagpole. Without warning, a bolt of lightning came from the sky. It hit the pole and raced to the ground. "Oh!" George cried a moment later. She had been knocked to the ground by a shock wave from the discharge. Nancy and Bess felt the tingle of electricity passing through their bodies. "Are you hurt?" Nancy asked George quickly. Her friend stood up and declared, "I'm all in one piece, but I don't want any more shocks like that. I'll have more respect for lightning after this." The girls walked on to the car. When Nancy tried to open the door on the driver's side, she looked puzzled. "I didn't lock this door," she said. "Did either of you?" "No," the cousins replied. The door on the opposite side was also locked, and Nancy wondered who had done it. George suggested that possibly some teenager going past had done it for a joke. Maybe, Nancy replied and unlocked the doors. It was warm inside. Bess took off her sweater and tossed it onto the rear seat. Why do you suppose the spirit voice said I'd be going to the marriage license bureau soon? She asked. George grinned. Well, you're going sooner or later, aren't you? That old fake spook was just guessing about when. Bess blushed. Yes, but he sort of shook me up. When they reached the motel, she turned around and reached over to retrieve the sweater. Nancy, she said, what's this cardboard box on the floor? I don't know, Nancy answered. I didn't put it there. The girls stepped out of the car and Nancy picked up the box. It's pretty heavy, she said. I wonder what's in it. Suddenly, a frightening idea came to Bess. Nancy, put it down. Don't open it. There might be a bomb inside. That would be pretty scary. I am now going to read chapter 8, and this, depending on the time, may be the last chapter. We will see. Gingerly, Nancy set the mysterious box in the driveway of the motel. She eyed it meditatively. Finally, she said, I don't believe there's a bomb inside. If it was intended for us, it would have gone off by this time or be ticking. Bess urged Nancy not to open the box. She said, maybe when you lift the lid, the thing will go off. By this time, George's curiosity was getting the better of her. I'd like to know what's in the box, she said. Nancy looked around for something with which to pry it open. George spotted a long-handled garden tool propped against the garage. That rake's just what we need. She got the rake and handed it to Nancy. Then, keeping at what she had considered a safe distance, Nancy gently pried up the lid. It fell to one side. The three girls burst into laughter. The box was full of papers. What a mean joke, said Bess. Nancy and the cousins walked over and looked more closely. There seemed to be an assortment of letters and documents inside. On top lay a hand-printed request. Nancy drew, I beg of you, keep these papers safe until I come for them. There was no signature, but Nancy told Bess and George she was sure these were the papers which Madame Tarantella had begged her to take along. George snorted. She certainly was determined that you'd get them. What are you going to do now? Call my father and ask his advice. Unfortunately, there was no answer when she dialed her home. I'll call Dad in the morning, she said. Meanwhile, Bess and George had been discussing how and when the box had been put in the car. It must have been during the time we were in the seance room before Madame Tarantella came in, George surmised. She was probably the one who locked the car doors, so no one could steal the papers. While Nancy and the cousins prepared for bed, they talked about the strange turn of events and why Nancy had been chosen by the medium to keep the papers for her. There's something sinister in back of the whole thing, Bess declared. I certainly hope, Nancy, that you won't have another thing to do with that woman, even if the ghost hunters don't solve this particular mystery. Before breakfast the next morning, Nancy again telephoned her father. This time he was at home. After hearing the story, he said, have nothing to do with those papers. Take them right back to that Madame Tarantella. All right, Dad. I just wanted to be sure that was what I should do with them rather than keep them as evidence against this woman if she's doing something illegal. The lawyer reminded Nancy that the papers were private property. Even though the medium asked you to keep them, she didn't suggest that you read them. All right, Dad, I'll take them back. At breakfast, Nancy told the full story of the evening's happenings to Ned, Bert, and Dave, but she did not reveal the prophecy about Bess. Would you all like to drive down to the medium's hut with me? I wouldn't miss it, Dave answered. I'd like to see this strange creature, he grinned. Maybe she can tell me something about my future. At this, Bess turned scarlet, and Dave asked worriedly, Did I say something I shouldn't have? Nancy and George could not refrain from laughing. George said, Let Bess tell you what Madame Tarantella said about her immediate future. I'll do nothing of the sort, Bess replied indignantly, and if you girls dare say a word. Oh, come on, Dave coaxed, but the three girls remained silent. Nancy and George wondered whether Dave would somehow make Bess tell him what the prophecy had been. A little while later, the three couples drove into Vernonville and went directly to the medium's hut. There was no answer to their persistent knocking. Do you suppose she isn't at home or just won't let us in? George asked. Nancy shrugged and suggested that they do a little shopping and come back later. Just then, a young woman came out of an apartment house across the street. She called over to them. Are you looking for Madame Tarantella? Yes, we are, Nancy replied. The woman smiled. I guess she won't be telling any more fortunes here. Why? George asked. The neighbor said that about 2 o'clock that morning. Wow, that's really early. Okay. 2 o'clock that morning, a car and a truck had driven up to the hut. Boxes, suitcases, and all sorts of paraphernalia were packed into the two vehicles. Then Madame Tarantella drove off in the car with two men. Maybe she was kidnapped, Bess exclaimed. The medium told our friend Nancy last night that she was afraid some man was going to harm her and rob her. The neighbor looked alarmed. If that's the case, I hope the police won't ask me for a description of those people in the car, because I don't want to become involved. Anyway, I couldn't see the men well enough. Did you notice anything about them? Nancy queried. Well, one was tall and slender and had bushy hair. The other man was shorter. The ghost hunters looked at one another. Could the tall, slender, bushy-haired one be Wilbur Prizer? The neighbor went on to say, I'm glad Madame Tarantella's gone. Why? Ned put in. Because too many funny-looking characters were always coming out of and going into that place. You mean dishonest-looking people? Nancy asked. Well, I can't exactly say that, but I wouldn't want any of them calling on me. Sorry couldn't help you more. I've got to go now. She hurried down the street. The girls drove back to the motel, and again Nancy telephoned to her father. I certainly don't want you involved in this, he told his daughter. I know a lawyer in Vernonville named Kittredge. I'll get in touch with him and see if he would be willing to keep the box in his safe and to ask the police to hunt for the vanished medium. She may have been kidnapped. Mr. Drew advised Nancy to stay in her room and wait for a phone call. About half an hour later, she received a message from Mr. Kittredge saying he would be over in a little while. Please wait for me, he requested. I'll come to your room and pick up the papers. From what your father told me, it probably would be best if you did not appear on the street again with them. Nancy promised to stay right there. She suggested to Bess and George that they need not wait. She would join them later. We'll get the others and go down to the pool, George said. The water looked so inviting. The girls had been gone only a short time when there was a knock on the door. Nancy opened it. Hi, Helen, she said. You alone? Helen asked, stepping inside. Yes, I'm waiting for a friend of Dad's. As Helen moved past the table on which Nancy had set the box of papers, she accidentally knocked it to the floor. The contents scattered in every direction. I'm sorry. Helen said. I'll help you pick them up. As Nancy began to return the papers to the box, she noticed that one was a drawing which showed a section of a property development. She went on gathering up the papers. Oh, she exclaimed. What's the matter? Helen asked. Here's a letter to Madame Tarantella, signed Wilbur Preiser. Helen was amazed. Do you think there's some connection between the two? I'm beginning to think so more and more, Nancy replied. As she went on picking up the papers, Nancy presently came across a telegram. The sender's name and address had been cut off. It was addressed to Madame Tarantella and said rare, medium, well done. What in the world does that mean? Helen asked. Nancy smiled. All I can do is guess. Of course, it's a takeoff on words applied to cooked meat. I think it's a code. Perhaps medium means Madame Tarantella, and she did some rare bit of work and was being told she had done it well. Clever deduction, Helen remarked. Many thoughts and conjectures were racing through Nancy's mind as the last of the papers were placed in the box. She set it back on the table, which was near the door. She and Helen continued to talk as Nancy moved over to the burrow and looked in the mirror to see if her hair needed recombing. The next moment she froze. Reflected in the glass was a man's hand and arm reaching around the corner of the partially open door to the hall. He was about to grab the box. Okay. We have enough time to read chapter 9. Okay. Chapter 9, Motel Apparition. With a mighty leap, Nancy was across the room. She grabbed the hand of the unseen man. There was a loud yell in the hallway, and the hand was wrenched away. Helen, lock yourself in, Nancy cried out and dashed to the hall. A tall, slender man wearing a straw hat pulled low on his head was bounding toward an outside door. Nancy sped after him. The door opened directly into the garden where the pool was. As the would-be thief ran across the garden, the sunbathers looked up in puzzlement. They were even more puzzled to see Nancy chasing the man. Stop him! Nancy yelled to Ned and the other boys. Immediately, they stood up and sped after the fleeing figure. The man was very agile and easily vaulted a low cement wall at the far end of the garden. His pursuers were over it in a jiffy. As Nancy leaned against the wall to catch her breath, Bess and George and the other ghost hunters hurried up to her. Who was he? What did he do? George asked. Nancy told them what had happened. At once, Bess cried out, How awful! The girls waited a long time before the boys returned. Unfortunately, they were not escorting any prisoner. He got away, Ned reported. Some sprinter. I'll say, Bert added. He was the fastest thing on two legs I've seen in a long while. Where did the man go? Nancy asked. He ran off through some woods behind a house and disappeared. When we reached the other side of the woods, we found a road. He probably went off in a car. Nancy asked whether the boys had had a good enough look at the man to identify him. The boys shook their heads, but Ned said, I think I saw bushy hair sticking out from under his hat. Preiser! George exclaimed. Nancy told the boys about the attempted theft and said she had left Helen locked in. I'd better get back, she said. As Nancy neared her door, she saw a man standing in the hall. He was somewhat heavy-set and was a stranger to her. From inside the room, she heard Helen call out, I won't let you in until Nancy Drew comes back. Well, she'd better hurry, the caller replied. I'm a busy man. Nancy walked up to him and introduced herself. And you are? Mr. Kittredge. Your father asked me to come here for a box of papers. Yes, Mr. Kittredge. We've had a little trouble. That's why my friend won't let anyone into the room. Nancy called to Helen to unlock the door. When it was open, she introduced Helen and the lawyer. You had some trouble? He said, following Nancy into the room. Then I assume you want some identification from me. Nancy laughed. It saved me the embarrassment of asking you. As Mr. Kittredge showed his driver's license and a couple of credit cards, Nancy told him about the man who had tried to steal the box of papers. He got away, but my friends and I think he's a man named Wilbur Prizer. Helen apologized to Mr. Kittredge for keeping him in the hall. I don't blame you for being careful, he said, smiling. She turned to Nancy. I found a small white shell. It must have fallen out of Madame Tarantella's box. The shell was the shape of a pyramid and was about 5 inches high. Mr. Kittredge took it and said, This is very interesting. Its nickname is the fraud shell. The right name is Epitonium scalari. The lawyer explained that the shell was a rather rare type found in deep water off the coast of China. Many years ago, it was in great demand but very difficult to find. Even at that time, it sold for $280. The Chinese saw a good way of making money. They figured out a way of imitating these shells in rice flour paste. And did they get away with it? Helen asked. They did for a long time, Mr. Kittredge answered, but finally a collector who had purchased one tried to wash the shell in water. Nancy smiled. And it dissolved? Exactly. The shells are more plentiful nowadays because deep-sea divers go down for them. I've heard that the old frauds are more expensive than the real shells. Nancy examined the shell, but found no markings of any kind. She returned the Epitonium scalari to the box. Have this package so it won't be recognized by anyone who may be lurking around, Nancy told the lawyer. She found a large paper laundry bag in the closet of the room. The box was slipped into the bag. Then Mr. Kittredge left. Nancy and Helen discussed the latest development and the mystery for a few minutes. Then Nancy said, I think I'll put on my bathing suit and go for a swim. I will too, Helen said. Jim will be looking for me. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Nancy opened it. Helen gave a cry of surprise. A ghost-like figure stood in the hall, one arm raised menacingly. Instantly, Helen jumped in front of Nancy and slammed and locked the door. Another spooky thing. What's going to happen to us next? Nancy did not comment. She stared at the door, trying to figure out what the apparition was. Helen spoke up. How silly of me to be afraid of that thing. What kind of ghost hunter am I? Nancy opened the door. The apparition was disintegrating. Oh, what is it? Helen asked. Nancy closed the door again. I believe it's some form of odorless gas, she said. It might be poisonous. I think I'd better phone the manager of possible danger to people coming into the hall. It took Nancy a few minutes to convince him this was not a hoax and would be to the best interest of everyone staying at the motel to keep all the guests out of the corridor until the air could clear thoroughly. You've convinced me, Miss Drew, she said. Of course, I still can't understand why anyone would do such a crazy thing or try to play such a mean joke on you, but I'll do as you suggest. Nancy got ready for her swim as she and Helen waited for the hall to clear. I have a hunch, Nancy said, that it was Wilbur Prizer who rigged the gas ghost. As you recall, he has considerable technical knowledge. But Nancy, said Helen, do you think Wilbur Prizer would dare come back here so soon after being chased away? I think he still wanted to get the box of letters. Of course he did. He couldn't know that Mr. Kittredge was coming and that he took the papers. Prizer probably had somebody who works with him rig up that phantom. Helen smiled. The ghost maker expected us to run away in fright, not slam the door in the apparition's face. Nancy nodded. Then he was going to come into the room and steal the box. Both girls giggled as they thought of how they had outwitted their enemy by remaining in the room. Nancy pointed out, however, that all of this did not explain why Prizer wanted to get the papers away from Madame Tarantella, or how he knew Nancy had them. It's too much of a muddle for me, Helen remarked. She opened the door. I don't see any trace of the apparition. I'll hold my breath and race to my room to put on my swimsuit. After she had gone, Nancy's telephone rang. Hello, she said. A woman's deep voice said, Is this Nancy Drew? Yes. Nancy Drew, the caller went on. I have an important message for you from the spirit world. Thank you so much for joining me today in Turn the Tide Thursday. I hope that you guys will have a good rest of your week. And unfortunately, I will not be able to make it next week, but I'm hoping for the week after. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled on the wave and see what happens. May you be able to enjoy what comes your way and be able to handle what comes to you too, for it only lasts a moment. Desert Mermaid signing off. Thank you.